March 4th, 2023. Well, we're having some significant developments in the Russo-Ukraine war. It looks like Bakhmut is just about to fall to the Russians. There is a lot of evidence that the Ukrainian army is beginning a withdrawal, probably trying to do an organized withdrawal before they get totally encircled from that position. And the head of the Wagner group is claiming that they'll be over with in about 2 days, as of probably yesterday. So we'll see if that's exactly correct, but presumably the flanks are, as I understand, are being held by the more expert Ukrainian troops, the north and the south, and the less more provisional type troops or whatever are actually in the city and are pulling out. So, and I guess they also are going to try to evacuate maybe the remaining civilians if possible. I don't know how that's going to go. The problem is most of the roads are either cut off or they're actually under direct fire from the Russian military. There is one road that's open. However, even there with drones and artillery, I'm not sure it's a safe place to travel. On foot, you might be able to just walk out of it, though, by not going on the road, but going off road and getting away. We'll see how that turns out, but that will be kind of a big psychological development for the Russians. However, of course, it's people say it's of limited strategic value. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but for some reason, both countries have put a lot of lives at risk fighting for that, and so presumably the Ukrainians will have a line of defense further back that they'll be falling back to, and so it'll probably be this all over again. It doesn't look to me like the Russians will be in position to engage in a rapid advance to really take full advantage of this, as far as I can tell. So, but we'll see what develops there. I think that's kind of what's afoot. Another thing I want to kind of get into here is I read an article on Substack, which is called the Russo-Ukrainian War, the Schrodinger's Offensive. Kind of an allusion to physics and the Schrodinger cat concept, I guess. That is if you open the box, is the Russian army dead or is it alive? I guess that's the idea. At any rate, I'll get into that a little bit. By the way, if you like these videos, please give me a like to help out with the algorithm. You subscribe, and you can click the bell for notifications. Yeah, and this is a very good article. It's by a guy named plus Big Surge or something. So I don't know much about who this guy is. I guess it's some kind of a person who doesn't want to be identified, perhaps a person in the military, perhaps an official position that doesn't really want to go public, or just a person that just doesn't want to be, who knows. At any rate, it gives a lot of information, and I'm finding a lot of my ideas that were put out in previous videos on this subject are kind of confirmed by this, and I'll kind of go into that a little bit as we get into it. But essentially, he kind of presents what happened with the Russians. It goes into the history of the post-Soviet Russian army and how it kind of collapsed into almost a cadre strength version of the Soviet army initially, and then eventually they tried to reorganize it in various ways to suit the aftermath of all that in a more less totalitarian Russia, let's put it that way. It's certainly not a free Russia, but it's not as totalitarian as it was under the Soviets, of course. So, and anyhow, so essentially what they came up with is a concept of career soldiers that are like the enlisted people, and then there's also conscripts that sort of flesh out the army. And because of the lack of, they sort of create a situation called battalion tactical groups, which are kind of a really reinforced battalions with some artillery and armor in the mix, and they're really light on infantry is the way he describes it. And that explains the fiasco Russia ran into in the invasion last year, because they really didn't have adequate infantry to shield their tanks from various kinds of ambushes, and well, we saw what happened. But after mobilization, they now are finally reaching where they have large amounts of infantry recruited and probably have lost some of their significant amount of their armor. So they're kind of reorganizing in a whole different concept. And this article presents the viewpoint that a lot of what's going on is still they're probably in the process of trying to really develop their new organization and get it put in place. Now the question is, well, what happened with the Russian offensive? Well, it's actually been ongoing for the past few weeks, but it's not maybe what we thought it was going to be. It's definitely, even I had been saying I'm doubting it's going to be a blitzkrieg. Well, it's more like a World War I style offensive. In this article, he looks at 3 different battles and shows how they're really, this is almost reminds me of a chess game played out with infantry and artillery and armor. And the whole idea is to take positions of strength, hilltops, cut off supply lines, and then force people either to retreat or be captured, and slowly but surely envelop in step-by-step maneuvers various positions, which is what happened in the latest battle there at Bakhmut with the Wagner Group's offensives. And apparently, another thing I just saw on Crux, which presents the idea that the regular army is developing some of the organizations and tactics that Wagner has developed and used, and I guess it's spreading to the rest of the army to some extent. And so anyhow, that's kind of what's ongoing. But in fact, if you look at the maps, like on Sky News, we try to, at any rate, it shows you that the Russians have been on an offensive for some time, and they're gradually taking ground, but it's a slow motion effort. And so it looks like with the weather now, warming up and the ground getting muddy again, it's doubtful there's going to be any major armored advances or anything else of that sort in the near term. Probably anything of that sort, whether on the Ukrainian side or on the Russian side, is probably going to wait until late spring when things finally dry out, probably maybe May, I guess, when more off-road maneuver is possible. And so that's kind of where we're looking at with this development. Now, I think we'll point out that the issue that really is important when we look at who's, quote, winning the war or losing, the question comes down to kind of in a case of exchange ratio in a very morbid sense of what are the casualties on either side. And that's as near as we can tell, and the news we get over here, is on mainstream media is mostly propaganda, in my opinion. I'm sure if you were in Russia and watching what they're going, you're probably getting mostly propaganda. So that's the point I've been saying all along, and I've been trying to, kind of go between the two ideas. I mean, our analyst General Keane is represents the mainstream viewpoint, being a former deputy chief of staff of the U.S. Army, and has his own think tank, the Institute for Study of War. So I'm sure probably has contracts with the U.S. Defense Department, and probably doesn't want to be. He's got to kind of stick to the party line a little bit too, while he is an expert. On the other hand, you have Colonel McGregor, who's another outspoken person, taking the completely opposite viewpoint. But you have to add that here you have a really, top thinking person whose military career was obviously stifled at the rank of bird colonel because, I think he had some politically incorrect viewpoints. Although he does have a PhD in international affairs and wrote several accepted books on military strategy that would impress some of the 4-stars in his day before, I guess, his career kind of ran amok, making recommendations to pull out of Iraq in 2005. So, in other words, I want to say that I think that both these people have their own agenda, but they're both also highly competent. So I'm taking the position, and have been increasingly, as somewhere between the two, if you've been following what I'm saying. I think there's, the Russians are not nearly as strong a position as McGregor would like to make out, and they're not as weak as all the Western commentators would make out either. Perhaps that's kind of the illusion of the idea of the Schrodinger cat idea with respect to the Russian army. Is it dead or alive? Well, I think the answer is it is alive and it's regrouped, but I think at the present time, I think they're considering success if they can just inflict enough attrition on the Ukrainian forces to disrupt any attempts to launch a major offensive. For instance, if they, as they seem to have thrown a lot of units into fighting at Bakhmut and took a lot of casualties doing this, these are people that could have been, in many instances, training and preparing to use this forthcoming Western military equipment for their offensive, but instead they've been depleted in these battles. The Russians, on the other hand, the Wagner group is a group of mercenaries, which did even some recruiting from prisons, although that's not the overall nature of their forces. And I can understand they've now quit recruiting from prisons for whatever reason. Um, but that may indicate a little bit about the Russian attitude toward what their outcome is, let's say. But but anyhow, it looks like the Russians aren't as bad off as often portrayed. For instance, I've saw articles claiming that in the Battle of Volodar, and he covers that very good in this article too on what happened. Um, it's a case where again the Ukrainians have fought very well. They were on the verge of losing it apparently, and then counterattacked effectively, supported by artillery that was available to them, and drove the Russians back. And after that, it's been some costly battles, but it's obvious that the famed annihilation of the 155th Russian Naval Infantry Brigade is a little bit overstated. Apparently, they've suffered something like 300 casualties, but they're still in the battle. But they have been repulsed on various occasions, and the situation is the Ukrainians have used some effective strategies using drones, artillery, and a lot of mines. And the road conditions kind of force people to stay on the road. If you get off the road, you run into mines and mud. So hence they're holding out, and it's a pivotal point for probably one of the next focuses, I suspect, for the critical battle for the Ukrainians to hold out in. So anyhow, so that's that kind of gives you an idea. There's other areas too where there's slow moving advances that are occurring. Now, so another interesting thing is apparently the 14 Polish Leopard 2 tanks have showed up in Ukraine, and the Russians are claiming that one of them was moving toward Bakhmut and allegedly got stuck in the mud and has been captured. I'm going to call I'm not so sure on that. That sounds to me like a little bit of Russian propaganda at this point, until I see some real visual evidence that they've done it. It sounds like something that they cleverly want to say right now, really, but they claim they have a picture. But then again, Photoshop. I don't necessarily buy that. But the danger that could happen with this Russian offensive, even though it's slow moving, is if this equipment is thrown into battle piecemeal here and there, rather than organized in a concentrated armored formation for their big offensive, they may not be in position to really be very effective. And my own thought is at this stage, the Russians' best strategy, because remember, a lot of Russian capability is not on the front line right now. They have been able to develop significant strategic reserves behind the lines, armored formations and the like. And I think probably the best Russian strategy is to continue what they're doing and wait for the Ukrainian offensive and try to cut it off and repulse it. I think that would be their best strategy. I kind of make an analogy to the situation in World War II. After the Normandy invasion, about 2 months in, there was a breakout at a town known as Saint-Lô, and the U.S. Army and to the north, the British Army made major advances in the next about month and a half toward the German border, and then there was an operation called Market Garden where they tried to straighten out the line and get the British up to where Patton had reached as far as the line to straighten it out. But after that was over, for the next roughly 3 months to the Battle of Bulge, the Allied advances were very minuscule. There was a lot of fighting along the line, but really not much advance. Really nasty stuff in the mud, kind of like we're talking about here, actually. And then after the Battle of the Bulge, when the Germans threw their last reserves and lost and had them cut off and destroyed, then the U.S. and the British and all the Allies were in a perfect position to begin their advance all the way into victory. So this could well be what might happen if the Ukrainians botch this thing and lose a lot of this equipment in a failed offensive. Then they might find themselves in a bad situation, although it won't be a complete victory by anybody. I don't think, I'm dubious that the Russians can achieve that. Although we never know. I mean, if the ammunition supplies to the Ukrainians do fall to a low enough level, and if we can't keep up the pace, even for a few months, the situation could collapse dramatically. And that's why there's a lot of pressure to try to get ammunition from wherever we can have it, to the Ukrainians for them to maintain a defense. So that's kind of my update for this time. I think we'll just have to, as always, keep watching what's happening. My own opinion remains that if the Russians are held at bay right now, isn't it time to start trying to open negotiations to end this conflict? I mean, end it now while the Ukrainians do have a strong position of defense still before things might go a lot worse. I mean, I think that me that's the approach. Remember, there's a lot of sanctions on the Russians as well, and negotiations could perhaps deal with relieving sanctions in return for land and things of that sort. It's hard to know how flexible the Russians would be on that, although it's possible that they're convinced that they can win the war and therefore they're not willing to negotiate, and perhaps the Ukrainians are so desperate to not lose their land that they won't negotiate either, and the killing continues. But at any rate, that's kind of the way I see it. But we'll just have to continue to monitor what happens. And by the way, I hope that people like my my somewhat tongue-in-cheek review of FBI Director Wray's interview on Fox News. I hope people didn't think I was being too soft on him. I remember when I kept saying not candid. That was what they said about Anthony, the assistant director McCabe, that was working to undo Trump. And they said when he was questioned by the Inspector General, his answers were not candid. So anyway, that was what I was alluding to there, if anybody didn't catch it. At any rate, so as always, I'll be posting this on Rumble as well as, of course, YouTube. And my addresses of my social media accounts are below. You might definitely want to follow me on Twitter if you're on Twitter. Or that's where I post the most. I do post these videos and occasionally other things on all the other ones. So that's all for this time.